Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of 400 Years Later, a podcast that aims to see how Shakespeare relates to our own time. Today I am joined by Anja Schrag, a senior theater arts major with minors in English and philosophy. Anja, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. Well, like Rachel said, I'm a theater major here at Illinois Wesleyan. I'm mostly interested in dramaturgy as a theater major, so I do a lot of background and contextual historical research for productions, and I've also done some work with autoethnography and solo performance work, so that's kind of all the stuff that I'm interested in theater, and of course Shakespeare as well, which is why I'm here today.
Awesome. And I ask all of my guests on the episodes, so I've got to ask you as well. Why is it important to study Shakespeare after 400 years? Or is it?
It is important for a few reasons, I think. Some of Shakespeare's work gives us perspective on the way that we interact with similar topics today, like how you've been doing this podcast, taking a topic that is current and then seeing how it was played out, or at least some version of how it could have been played out those 400 years ago. I've also been really recently interested in language, so I feel like as a study of the English language, Shakespeare is super interesting, just how a lot of people say that it seems so different from our usage of language, which is true, but it's also not that different because it's still English. All the words that he uses are words that could be used today, but just the way that it's shaped and put into the format that it is, or the structure that it is in Shakespeare, just seems so different. And I think that's really interesting to think about how our language has evolved, and Shakespeare as an example of that, as something that there's obviously been a lot of changes made, but also at the same time is not as different as it, I think, first appears to be.
Yeah, that's something I talk about a lot, is when I think of Shakespeare, I think of it as being some ancient text, and it's not really. First off, it was only 400 years ago, which in the history of time isn't that long, but also, just as this podcast shows, things that were relevant then are just as relevant now. A lot of social issues that he touches on still matter to us today and remain mostly unsolved. So as much as I read that iambic pentameter, Old English, and I'm confused and I have to sit and read it 3 times over, what he's saying sometimes isn't so different from what, I'd expect to be said today.
Yeah.
All right. So anyway, today we will be talking about King Lear and reflecting on how King Lear informs today's poor treatment of older people. And I also wanted to briefly touch on how King Lear shows us how we should or should not care for and love imperfect people. So just a brief intro to King Lear for those who are unfamiliar. King Lear is a tragedy, and it's about an aging king who decides to retire and split his kingdom between his 3 daughters, Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. Before this is made official, he asks each daughter basically to flatter him and shower him with praise. Cordelia, his favorite, does not, so he cuts her out of her inheritance, and she leaves with her new husband, the King of France. Now retired, Lear hopes to maintain his lifestyle and authority as king, but Goneril and Regan won't have it. The tragedy follows the sisters' grasp for power in conjunction with Edmund, the Earl of Gloucester's son out of wedlock. So that's just a brief intro. Obviously, there's a lot more to the tragedy than that, but I was going to leave it up to you, Anja. Would you describe Lear as a character to us, how you see him?
Sure. I think he's a really interesting character of Shakespeare's because he has a lot going on. It's interesting because even though he's a king, obviously, he isn't really by the time we get to him, because he gives his kingdom away at the very beginning of the text. And so we hear a lot about his power and reputation, but it was all before the play that we see, so it kind of is always alluding to something that is never really there for the audience or the reader, which I think is interesting. And he definitely has something to him because he has these other characters who are so intensely loyal to him and follow him, the Fool and Gloucester and his daughter Cordelia, who he disowns at the beginning, but even with that, she is the only one who really comes back and helps him out of his daughters. Like, she comes back and helps him even at the cost of her own life. So there is some sort of leadership power that he has, but it's a bit depressing that we don't get. I think that's part of the tragedy of it, is we don't get to see any of that, but we get the sense of the fragments or the remains of it from the people around him and how they see him, because he's definitely very rapidly deteriorating throughout the text, and we see all his confusion and just like this loss of this assumed great knowledge and ability that he once had, and now I think that's the part why it's so sad, is like we just sort of see him declining until he perishes at the end of the play.
Yeah, it reminds me of that intro. He talks about how you start off with this super regal king who commands authority at his very wish and whim, and then by the end of the play, you're left with a shell of a man who has really been out in nature and is transformed. But anyway, so I'm really latching on to you saying we're missing so many pieces of his past. Mm-hmm. And that makes me wonder, and I have to ask you, because I know a lot of our peers were concerned with this. Mm-hmm. Do you think that Lear was a good father based on how we see him interact with his daughters in the tragedy?
I want to be like charitable, I guess, to him. Because I feel bad for him, obviously. So that's, I think, the struggle is like you feel so bad for him, so you don't want to completely write him off, but there isn't much evidence of him being the best father throughout the play and how he interacts with his children. So I guess I want to say that I think that he wants to be a good father but is unable to do so. I don't know if that's due to his own moral failings or mindset, or if it's due to outside factors of like how he feels a father or a king should act, and it just comes off like too harsh and like patriarchal and like not very fatherly, or if it's a combination of those. So I think I want to be kind of nice to him and be like, not immediately say that he's a bad father. I think his power also is something that has prevented him from being a good father. And so when we start to see him lose it, I think he becomes a better father. Like in the scene where he's reunited with Cordelia, even though there is some struggle of recognition, it's hard for him to recognize her. There is, I feel like, some tenderness, like kindness in there. I think he is genuinely sorry for the way that he has treated her, and it is I don't know if it's like too little, too late. Some people might think that, but I feel like if he was not a good father, he at least has regret because he wasn't, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense. When I think about Lear and any imperfections he might have, my mind immediately goes to that night scene. Mm-hmm. When he's newly retired, he's staying with Goneril, and so are his 100 knights.
Right.
And they're having a little party, the fool's making everybody laugh, and Goneril comes, and everyone just kind of treats her like she's a nobody.
Yeah,
and
like completely disrespects her.
Yes, it's super misogynistic, and for a moment, one almost sympathizes with Goneril, and it's hard to write off Lear's treatment of Goneril as just a product of its time, because he's her father and he doesn't stand up for her really on any level. He rather contributes to his knight's unruliness. But like you said, that could be a combination of things. And I kind of see it as he's lived in a patriarchal society. He was used to being king and doing whatever he wants, and it's hard for him to recognize her new authority and treat her with the respect that she deserves.
But and it's ironic, though, because he's the one that gave her that new authority as well.
Yes. It's like he wants all the benefits without any of the work. But anyway, my point being, he's a problematic character on some levels, at least maybe as a father. But that doesn't justify the treatment that he receives, I don't think.
Yes, I do agree with that. But on that same note, I guess it's hard to blame the daughters in the same way, because if they've learned that from him, it's kind of only going to come back to him. But that doesn't make any of it right, of course. It's just how it all unfortunately plays out.
It's like a generational cycle of aggressiveness and eventually violence, which kind of leads into some of the ways that the older people in King Lear are mistreated. So obviously we have Lear. The text tells us he's about 80 years old. And there's also Gloucester, who is one of his followers, father to Edgar and Edmund, and they are our two resident old people in the play. And we see them being abused, honestly, in a number of ways. First, obviously, with Lear financially. It seems that Goneril and Regan have inherited everything, and they don't leave very much for him, at least when they kick him out into the storm. So that's another point of abuse. They're being negligent and not offering him shelter and warmth and food from the storm outside. So he's abused in a number of ways. Just to kind of backtrack, they leave him out in this storm after Lear has gone to Regan's house for shelter, but Goneril arrives and consults with her sister, and they resolve that neither will accept him with his band of followers. Lear obviously isn't having that. He wants his buddies with him, so he has no choice but to run out into the storm, which is really kind of a heartbreaking moment in the tragedy because think about it, this 80-year-old man among lightning and thunder and pouring rain.
Terrible conditions, really.
Yeah. And doesn't seem like he has much with him, maybe a coat.
Right.
But
he's not very well equipped to deal with it. No,
not at all. I also wanted to point out there's an article, King Lear and the Duty to Die, by Han Bui, and she points out that the sisters refer to Lear as being unruly and unwise, and they use this labeling as justification for their treatment of Lear, and obviously that treatment is poor. And like we said, he is an imperfect father, but as we've also already acknowledged, he doesn't deserve what he gets.
Right.
What are the effects of Lear going out into the storm? You said earlier that he deteriorates faster than one might expect. Can you expand on that a little bit?
The coherentness of the other characters he interacts with, he sort of starts to match. So, like, when you see him in the storm, then he happens upon poor Tom, who is, I was confused, Edgar and Edmund, I think. Edgar disguised as poor Tom, so he's pretending to be this person who escaped from the asylum. And so he's just sort of saying a lot of nonsense, and then King Lear sees him and views him as this philosopher, and is like, oh, I want to hear what this wise man has to say, when everyone else on stage who is still, like, keeping it together is sort of like, who are you talking about? Like, this is not, he doesn't know what he's talking about at this point. And then we see, it kind of keeps going with, he has this, like, fake trial that he does, where he, like, has this stool he thinks is Goneril, and then he puts her on trial, and then the fool and, like, poor Tom kind of play along with him. It would be a little bit out of, like, pity, and probably because they don't really know what's going on. So besides, like, this loss of power, like, this sense of his role, there's definitely, like, a very real, like, mental deterioration that is, like, shown. And then later when we see that he is, like, very slow to recognize who his own daughter Cordelia is, like, he is kind of scared to recognize her almost, which might be because of guilt, but also because I think he is really, his mind is really starting to go. Like, it's just not there for him anymore, which is really sad. And I think that's kind of also, it's, like, hard to know what to make. Also, if he wasn't a good father, I don't know if the person that we see is the same person who wasn't a good father, if that makes sense. Like, he's not in the same state that he was when he did those things, and so I can understand why, like, as a person, he still is associated with that, how he acted by the people around him, but I feel like the people who know him so well should be able to see that he's not coming from the same place anymore. Like, this King Lear is not the same one who they knew in the same way. And I think it's also interesting, like, we talked about how King Lear is not used to his lack of power. I think the same case is that his daughters are not either. So I think that's maybe that might be sort of a justification for their treatment of him, is they still see him as this person with all this power, and so they're scared to, like, let him in or let him have all these followers with him, because then he might have too much power, but they're not, and they don't want him to gain more power, but they're not realizing that he has already lost that power and it's already transferred over to them, so they're just become so defensive in their trying to, like, protect themselves when they don't realize that he's now the one that he's protecting.
And I like what you said, that his aging was accelerated, and we kind of see him go into this mental decline. And it's been argued by a lot of people whether he actually goes mad or whether he has dementia, but you definitely notice he's not the same Lear he was, and he's at least troubled. No doubt is part to the treatment that he endures and the trauma that he goes through. And we also see this in Gloucester. Gloucester is one of the few characters who sides with Lear, and after being caught by Regan and Cornwall, he suffers the consequences of being loyal to his king.
Right.
Cornwall, in this terrible scene, plucks out both of Gloucester's eyes, rendering him blind. And as he does that, Gloucester cries out, and this is the third act, scene 7, "He that will think to live till he be old, give me some help. Oh, cruel, oh, you gods." That line was so heartbreaking for me because it shows how growing old for Gloucester seems to have been a worse fate than dying. And he feels abandoned by the gods. And this physical abuse that he's going through definitely sets him into a depression. Later, we see him even try to commit suicide and jump off a cliff that isn't actually there. But again, his mental state is altered because of what he's endured and been put through by younger people who are grasping for power.
Right.
In that same article I mentioned earlier, Bowie's article, she mentions a Renaissance belief that aging is felo de se, which means a felony of yourself, and leads to a more torturous life, which is super bleak.
Yeah, that's
God, how
really
terrible. I always like to think of aging as this beautiful thing,
like
and you get to, an accomplishment, and you get to spend time with your loved ones and do whatever you want all day. But man, in this tragedy, it really paints it out to be a terrible thing, and that you might as well just die. Terrible. But again, that's not so different from today's society. I think, at least I would argue, we do live in a somewhat ageist culture. It's always better to have the new and get out with the old. And maybe that's just consumerism, but I think it also has some truth in terms of how we treat one another. And just to really draw on that and speak the words from the ageist man himself of the play, Edmund, he writes up a fraudulent letter that he says is from his brother to himself. Obviously, Edmund has written it. And the letter says this: "This policy in reverence of age makes the world bitter to the best of our times, keeps our fortunes from us, till our oldness cannot relish them. I begin to find an idle and fond bondage in the oppression of age tyranny, who sways not as it hath power, but as it is suffered. Come to me, that of this I may speak more. If our father would sleep till I waked him, you should enjoy half his revenue forever, and live the beloved of your brother." So obviously this is a fake plot of Edmund to get his father Gloucester to turn on his brother Edgar. But again, it reflects sentiments of ageism and really just going for that inheritance and not being patient, not waiting, not cherishing those times with his father, maybe the numbered days they have left, but wishing to accelerate that death and reap the benefits. And it's really pretty sad. I mean, what do you make of this letter? Does it actually echo a larger theme of ageism?
Yes, I think so. I think this is also something that's interesting to talk about as young people. Like, obviously we are on that other side of this issue. But I think it's just, like, the idea of, like, the idea of the switching of power is, I think it's sort of, as we see it in the play and as it's sort of indicative how we see it in real life, like when people start to get old and retire, and then like the younger people are coming into the new positions of power, that like adjustment is really difficult. And I think power is a very dangerous thing. So then once people have it, they forget what it was like to not have it, and so you kind of become the thing that you didn't want to become. So like, I mean, like, it's obviously easy for in this letter for Edgar to say all this stuff about old people, but then obviously when he becomes old, which I guess he doesn't because he dies. Yeah. But if he became old, he wouldn't want to be treated the same way. But I think it's easy for someone who is younger and if you don't have any foresight on it, or you can't have hindsight on something that hasn't happened yet. So then you don't expect to ever get older. Like, you kind of get lost in I'm young now, and like that's how it's always going to be. And then it's like really a shock when you lose that, which I think is kind of what happens to like King Lear and Gloucester, like seeing that. and I think happens a lot in our society. I think it happens like even sort of like more quickly. I guess this sounds like a subtle level, but like, you know, like the generation above us, or like you always are like, oh, like I will never be like the millennials or whatever, because we're like Gen Z, I guess.
Yeah.
But, like I'll never be like them, but then it's like then we'll probably start to become them once like the generation Alpha, I think is under, or something like that. Like
Yeah.
it kind of it like we were saying, it's like a cycle that kind of keeps going. And also with the idea of like consumerism, I guess, like the usefulness of people or the uselessness of people. If people stop being quote unquote useful, they lose value, and then you forget about them, and then that's where like the negligence and abuse comes from, because it's like they don't matter as much because they're not useful to us anymore, especially like nowadays when everything is supposed to be so like efficient and productive all the time. So if someone is not able to do that physically or mentally, or for any reason because of like their age, then that's kind of a big obstacle for them, or creates a lot of issues in the way that other people view them.
Yeah, so I love what you said, that the older you become, the less efficient you are.
Right, which
you're,
is just
you're
natural.
seen as more
like,
useful.
Okay,
Yeah, definitely.
It's a good thing.
I totally see that. And going with that, thinking about the demographics of the United States and of many countries around the world, you see populations getting older and older, with fewer babies being born and fewer people entering the workforce. That has a lot of political scientists worried because, A, you have programs like Social Security, which are dependent on the young who are working to generate that tax revenue and provide for these older people who have paid their share when they were younger. They always talk about it as an inverted triangle. You have way too many older people at the top, not enough young people at the bottom. And it's hard, you know, and a lot of people are worried about what is going to happen as this just time moves on. There's going to be so fewer people, and I hope sentiments won't get so strong as young people like us will just see that top of the triangle as inefficient and useless, and why should I pay their taxes? But people are worried about it. Likewise, this population is likely going to be a nursing home or nursing homes, or at least a large portion of it, right? And obviously, we see the workforce shrinking and less people pursuing careers in nursing, and particularly in facilities for older people. And so there's a lot of logistical worries about aging and what that looks like today in our countries here in the 21st century. So it really strikes me because we live in such a fast-paced world where things move so quickly, and if you can't keep up, you're going to be left out. And so I'm worried, and maybe I should be worried, because I was taking a look at some statistics from the World Health Organization and the National Council on Aging, and there were some pretty startling facts. Just to name off a few, apparently 1 in 6 people who are 60 years or older have experienced abuse in the past year, and 2/3 of their perpetrators are their adult children or their spouses. So this is definitely a familial phenomenon. And those who are abused have a 300% higher risk of death than their peers who have not been abused. So even if, you're in poor health, if you're abused, but you have a much higher risk of dying than someone in your same exact position. Also, the websites tell us there's an increased likelihood of depression and cognitive decline. As we said, we already saw that in Lear and Gloucester. So it's reflected in their characters. And maybe King Lear offers a few ideas. In a University of Warwick interview with Sir Ian McKellen, who is an actor that played Lear for many years, they talk about how the show is maybe not so much a tragedy, but a show about love. What are your first impressions on that? Because it seems counterintuitive. It's a tragedy.
Yeah. I guess I can kind of see that, I guess, coming from maybe the opposite end of how love works, which is a way that it's not usually approached. I guess, because then I kind of end up thinking of like, well, is it about like a lack of love then that they have for each other? There's not this... Because I think some of the problem in King Lear seems to be that a lot of the relationships that they hold are more out of like obligation or even a bit contractual instead of just unconditional. Instead of being unconditionally reciprocated. So I guess I feel like if there was more love in it, that wouldn't, a lot of the issues they would have are, wouldn't come up. So I guess maybe it could be sort of like not maybe like a warning or like a suggestion that that's something that we all could consider, like having that lack of love is obviously not going to lead to very good things. So I don't know if that's kind of reinterpreting what they meant about it, but I guess that's what my first impression of hearing someone say that about King Lear.
Yeah, and as you said, there's definitely a lack of love rampant in that tragedy. True love, at least, unconditional familial love, and there's so much emptiness. But what Sir Ian McKellen is pointing out in that interview is that Shakespeare chooses to include characters like the Fool, Kent, and Cordelia. That it's through their unwavering loyalty to Lear that you can see a little bit of hope glimmering through, even at the very end, when all seems to have been lost. And they talk about even Gloucester is treated kindly by strangers. The servant, for instance, stands up to Cornwall as he plucks Gloucester's eyes out. And though he's not really a stranger, Gloucester thinks he is. Poor Tom treats him nice enough to guide him and keep him from jumping off a real cliff. His concluding remark on this topic in their interview, Sir Ian McKellen says, "Old people need love." And that just really struck me because you can provide old people with a million new pills that will help them live longer, and you can buy them all of this technology, get them a Netflix subscription, keep them busy. But just as we are young and we crave love, so do, if not more, older people. They need human connection and compassion, even if they're imperfect.
Right.
And I think that's tough. It's easier said than done because, as we know, Lear probably was not the best father, at least in my opinion. He seems pretty misogynistic, at least in the beginning, but he deserves better than what he got. And so do a lot of people. I think in my own life, I can already name a ton of imperfect older people I know who sometimes make it hard to care for them. I think that's fair to say. But that's how it is. And as you said, it's kind of the golden rule. We're young now, but someday we will be old, and we hope for the same treatment, at least I do, of good treatment and care. And maybe that's challenged by the huge shifting demographics around the globe, and maybe that will become even more tense as there's more people retiring, fewer being born, but I don't know. Any concluding remarks of hope, Anja?
I guess to kind of tie it to your whole thing about how Shakespeare is relevant here, I think when you were sharing those statistics, I thought it was very interesting how the characters in King Lear, as you said, like kind of lined up exactly with those, like as you were saying, people who are abused, like they deteriorate mentally faster and then they become more depressed, which we like literally see happening in King Lear, very specifically with the characters of Lear and Gloucester. And I think that's just, and I guess that's a credit to Shakespeare that he was able to, obviously in the time that he was writing it, they weren't collecting those statistics and like sharing them for the public. That wasn't happening. So it's very interesting how he was able to exactly pinpoint that in a very accurate way without having those exact facts, but he just had the sense of it from, I don't know where from, but he was able to capture the same sense of it that we're seeing. And like, I think like also you're saying with giving old people love over just like empty, just occupying them is also sort of seen in Lear, especially in that scene where he's going back and forth between, what's those two sisters?
Goneril and Regan.
Yes, Goneril and Regan, and they're like, why do you need this many knights? And then it's like, you're saying, because they're his followers, they love him, and he needs that connection, he needs that companionship, but they don't want to give it to him. So I think it does offer some hope, or it's sort of, I don't know about warning, but like, just sort of being aware, like you're saying, like we're young now, but we're not always going to be, and I think that's kind of what the last line in King Lear is about, which I don't know if I'm going to be able to quote it exactly now, but
just to paraphrase.
Yeah, Edgar, his last line of the play is something about like we that who are so young will never see so much. We have to be sympathetic to these people that are older than us because we don't know what they're experiencing, we don't know how that feels, and by the time we do, we won't be the young anymore.
Yeah.
So I think that's, I guess that's how I would interpret that last line, and I feel like that's going back to what you're saying of, like, we need to treat, like, before it's too late, like, we need to treat the others the way we want to be treated so then we don't end up becoming that as well.
I love that. What a way to full circle it. I love that. Well, Anja, thank you for joining us. I thought this was a really fruitful conversation.
Yes, me too.
I feel like if there were more conversations like this, maybe our fears will not come to fruition, which would be awesome.
Yeah, and I hope so.
Yes. Well, again, thank you. And of course, thank you to Professor Diaz. And thank you to you, all of the listeners. We'll be back next week. See you then.